Welcome to Voices in Social Work, a Carleton School of Social Work podcast. We discuss important topics in the field of social work and give you the tools to start some new conversations with those around you. We acknowledge that Carleton is located on the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin Nation and are exploring ways to support Indigenous communities who have suffered in order for us to be here and do what we do. Let's get started. Welcome to the first full-length episode of Voices in Social Work. Today I'm speaking to Emmy Koyanagi, who currently works as a BSW Practicum Coordinator at the School of Social Work at Carleton and is also a mental health therapist in her own private practice. We discuss what it means to be the token minority in a workplace and how members of both the minority group and the dominant group can respond. As a side note, during the interview, we both got excited that we're both third or fourth generation Asian Canadian. I don't meet that many people that share that with me, and we ended up diving deeper into our experiences in the first half of the episode. I think it's a great conversation, and I got to talk about parts of my life that I never really get to talk about. And I do think it's related to tokenism because it provides more of an insight on some of the experiences that minorities bring from their lives into the workplace. But if you want to skip to the actual discussion, it starts somewhere around the 26-minute mark of this episode. So I hope you enjoy. So just for everybody listening, would you mind introducing yourself and maybe talk about the kind of work that you do right now?
Okay, my name is Emmy Koyanagi, and let me start with the fact that I live and work on Algonquin territory, and I want to recognize that I'm a racialized settler. My work here obviously developed from a really long time ago, not just in the social work aspects and through academics, but also just my own work and personal experiences and growth. I'm actually not from Ottawa. I am originally from Vancouver. And for me, there's a lot of historical significance to that in the way that I think and I perceive a lot of things, including how I have come to this place of professionalism with my personal experiences as I identify as a woman of color and a racialized woman who also has a family history of generational trauma due to racism. So I do want to sort of like couch that in the fact that currently I am working as a practicum coordinator at the School of Social Work at Carleton. What I do recognize is I'm in that position after having many different work experiences, and that it has taken me this long to get to this position. It's not an easy pathway, and it's a lot of obstacles. And the work itself is very challenging, but it's really quite valuable in terms of trying to make sure that students are linked up for like work experiences that they will be able to take into their careers, and hopefully as well that they can then become supervisors themselves and role model, and understand how that works and how to integrate a lot of the things that we're going to be talking about today. I also do a bit of private practice through a national organization where I provide therapy to high performance athletes. So that's another piece that I'm doing all at the same time right now on hold, but soon to happen again, is that I will be teaching courses. And yeah, with that, there's a lot of thought about how to prepare students for working from maybe a multiverse of perspectives that maybe aren't very dominant out there. So that's a lot, but that's my intro to myself. Haha.
Just as a side note, I was curious. At least for me, I grew up in Toronto, and now in a lot of areas, there's a lot of people that look like me and that kind of thing. But I know when my parents were growing up in Toronto, that really was not the case. So I don't know if that's
Yeah.
like similar.
To your parents? Yes. Sort of. Sort of, because like when I was in elementary school, um, so this does date me, there, although I lived in the inner city, I think that the predominant number of kids in the neighborhood that I grew up in uh, were racialized. And that was quite unusual because when I went to university, my first degree, I did go to University of British Columbia, UBC, and it was at that time very white. And so I felt very out of place when I was going to UBC. And the people that I gravitated towards were others who had grown up in kind of like that same similar background as me, or, happened to be Asian. But at that point, it wasn't, uh, it was a bit shocking to me to know that not every neighborhood was fairly diversified. And going to university, it was like, whoa, this is kind of a shock. It was quite shocking to me. And yeah, after a while, it things changed, and also my perspective changed. Once I graduated, there were so many more folks of color that actually went to UBC. And I could see it because of the people that would get off the bus, or I would get onto a bus and I actually could see who was on the bus.
So was that like a big relief for you?
I can't say relief. Um, I'm not really sure what it was. I just found it super curious, and I really didn't understand what was going on because I didn't really have the analysis then. And as well, as I said, there was also the issue of being stereotyped because my family actually, I'm like third generation, almost fourth generation, born in Canada.
Me
And
too.
so my experience was really different from most of my friends who I grew up with, who were either first generation or second generation born in Canada. Or not even born in Canada, but immigrated when they were quite young. So my sort of sense of things was I couldn't quite navigate and negotiate what was actually happening at the time until I took sociology classes, and then I'm like, oh, I get it now. I understand, like I better understood what the history of immigration was about, and I understood what the labor movements were about, and about how racialized folks were not given the same opportunities, or all of that was contextualized for me. And then also for myself, I was able to go into my family's history of my parents having been born in Canada, and in Vancouver, in these different sort of sequestered areas, that were only for fishing families who were of Japanese descent. And then, of course, when World War II came along, that they were actually had their Canadian citizenship stripped. And so they were considered enemy aliens, even though they were born in Canada and had that identity for all of their lives. But yet, I know my mom would tell me she did experience a lot of racism going to school, being on the street. So I think that, all of that speaks to how, I look at these situations and about tokenism or racism, feeling at times that I was being extra critical of situations that perhaps many of my friends who are also racialized folks didn't really have the same kind of vigor in the way that I felt about these things.
For me, there's kind of a gap between like first and second generation and then like third and fourth generation. And you and I both kind of fall in the third and fourth generation category. We have more issue, or we feel like there's more issues because we were born here, our parents were born here, our family is completely based here, and we expect to belong because this is all we got. This is the only country that we know. And so we expect to be treated, and we understand everything that's going on, all the subtext that's going on, and we expect to be treated like with the exact same respect, but sometimes it doesn't happen. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that, but there's also that I maybe it's a bit different, but I always felt like I was that sort of gap generation where I would I understood, having lived in a those dual lives, where you're living in a home where there's certain rules and unwritten rules that you abide by, but once you leave the house and you go into like school or whatever institution, or you go to work, that there are different rules that you live by and you carry yourself differently, as, recognizing, okay, well, here I'm not going to expect that other people are going to understand me culturally at all. But I do expect that they should treat me with respect. There are times where I do know that I have a different kind of like pace of thinking and understanding and responding. And I've had to accept that over time because I feel like it comes from a real cultural root in that I don't necessarily react quickly when something happens, like I'm expected to respond, or even in school, when like elementary school, when you're called on to answer questions, I was never prepared. I always felt like, oh, I need a bit of time to like think about what I need to say, because I always felt like I have to say something on point, smart, and if I didn't, then I should say nothing at all. And I
That's the
don't
cultural
know.
piece you're talking about there.
Yeah, yeah. And that there's that self-silencing that happens. And I think that is a generational thing as well. That's been passed on down through generations. And, it had its place and purpose, but in some situations, it really doesn't work. To be able to be an advocate for myself, because it's like, nope, you gotta like stop and listen, and then maybe respond and see how it comes back. again, it's not just a cultural thing, it's a generational thing. It's that whole intersectionality. It's being a woman, it's being somebody who's from working class, it's being somebody who is like, around 5 feet, not, not, not over 5 feet. It's all these different things, the sizism, what have you. I've honed my abilities to be an observer first, and then possibly considering and saying something about the situation.
So you think you've taught yourself that? Like that's the piece that's not cultural? Sorry, I'm just a little turned around
I
here.
think it, I think it's both. I don't think it's just, you know, simply aligned to culture, and I don't think it's simply aligned with my own sort of like personality ways of being. I think that there are um, I don't know how to sort of like explain it really. Sometimes words don't really work. When I think about other communities and other cultures, let's say, that some of those things I can pinpoint as that's a cultural thing. But when you get to know somebody, oftentimes it's like, oh, maybe that's more of a personal thing,
It's
you
hard for
know?
me to tell in myself too. Like, is this like just my personality, or is it like kind of from the way I was raised or my culture? And it's like, I guess everything's kind of like a weird mix of both.
Yeah. Yeah. And sometimes it's kind of hard to know what is what. And for me, I feel like in I'll say the outside the home world, perhaps I'm a bit more careful. I'm a little bit more guarded. I'm a little bit more like not myself, because I, and I know there's a lot to be said about how we like all these binaries between being an introvert and an extrovert, let's say. I see myself as an introvert, but I've had to really work hard to be in an extroverted world. It might be seen more as a personality thing, as being an introvert, but I also see it as a real cultural thing.
One thing I was trying to think about too is I consider a lot of Asian communities to be more reserved. I have friends that are super extroverted. They they love to be loud and they love to like hang out all the time with their friends and all that. But I do think almost everybody I know has like there's like a little piece of like reservedness, even in people that are super extroverted. I can't really describe it. But I
Yeah,
think that's like the kind of the cultural piece too.
yeah. Well, and whether that's considered humility, perhaps. It's confusing, it's complicated, as human beings are complicated, but then there are also just all these different ways that we kind of look at, who we are and how we are in the world and how we interact with other people.
So I know you did mention this episode's supposed to be about tokenism, but we've kind of gotten sidetracked
Yeah,
because
sorry.
I don't get to talk to that many like third or fourth generation Asian Canadians. So I get
Yeah.
excited.
Well, it's like I rarely meet anybody. Like that's why I'm like, so, because it's a bit of a different perspective. Because, like, my friend, she said, yeah, you're pretty white. And I would be
Get that all the time.
how am I pretty white? Like, I don't get treated that way. I don't speak that way. For her, she's Chinese Canadian, second generation, but definitely had a really different experience. Um, her half of her family, her brother and sister were tons older than her, and they were born in another country. And so their experience was completely different from hers. And, so she saw me as being white. And I'm like, so white means that I have the cultural norms of being in Canada. I or being in Vancouver. I get it. But on the other hand, I was like, don't totally feel like I fit because I'm definitely not white.
Ah, oh man, yeah, I definitely understand that where it's like, okay, so I'm kind of halfway between, I guess. Um, a lot of my friends are first, second generation. I was born in 1996, so a lot of my friends, that's kind of when China took
Yep.
Hong Kong back. A lot of my
Yep.
friends came over around that.
1997.
My friends came over at that time.
Yeah.
So I have a lot of friends that were either like just born here or like they were born in Hong Kong and they came over here like when they were one or something. There's a huge culture gap between them and their parents. And yeah, it's just different. Like their experience of what it means to be Asian is completely different from mine.
Exactly. Exactly. And like I mean, even more so, I went to school and was friends with folks whose parents and like adult family lived in Hong Kong or Macau or somewhere else and had sent their kids, my friends, to live with their grandmother in a house in Vancouver and, to grow up there. And so their realities were completely different. Even like they had privilege of a lot of money, but not a lot of parenting and not a lot of understanding of how to actually live in a pretty racist world. And
I feel like
so,
even within the Asian community, we don't really understand each other. Like
yeah,
there's a huge range and it's
yeah.
so different. Yeah.
Oh, it totally is. But then you go to another country, because I lived in Thailand for a little bit. That was totally bizarre because I thought that I, I was Asian, but I distinctly did didn't feel like I fit in, and people there didn't feel like I fit in either. You're just feeling as though that's a whole different range of things because I was like, oh wow, like these are sort of my people, but not, it's such a weird, mind-blowing kind of place to be.
First time I went to Asia, I was like, I feel like people don't look at me the same way. Like they kind of just look at me and they're like, oh, whatever. Same old, which is kind of nice. It's comforting that how invisible I am. But as soon as we start talking, it's like, oh, they know. We're
Yeah,
not we're not of the same ilk at all.
exactly, exactly. And yeah, I mean, I went on a trip, a really short and fast tour trip of Japan with my mom, and that I didn't identify with anybody at all. And they totally kept on identifying me as, "Oh, you're from Taiwan?" And I'd be like, "No, I'm from Canada." Like, what? Where are you getting Taiwan from? It was weird. It was very weird. Yeah, but it was just because they said, "Oh, just the way you look." And I was
Oh,
like, "Oh, interesting." But no. And my family is from the the island of Kyushu, which is the southernmost island of Japan, and I just said, "Not everybody looks like everybody here in Tokyo." Like, I don't really get it. But yeah, so there's like a lot of weird, strange, like othering that was going on the entire time.
the stuff about othering is really interesting too, because I feel like there's not a lot of people like with our experience. So sometimes I feel like I get it from all sides. Like
Yep.
So, and then I'm kind of like, okay, I'll just be here in the middle.
Yeah,
Um,
I think that's a certain place, like, as I said, it's that sort of you fill in these little gaps. And so I don't know if that's a norm for those of us who are like third generation, fourth generation. It might be also, I don't know, but it may have some sort of cultural going on there.
One time I was like, as I was finishing up my degree, I kind of was doing some research in databases. I'm like, can I find anything that like describes how I'm feeling? And I couldn't really find anything. Like there isn't really anything out there on like the way like third and fourth generation um, immigrants see like their cultural identity. There isn't really much out there. I think a lot, I found some papers that were saying like, oh, we need to look into this in the future, but not there yet. So that was a little bit
Yeah.
frustrating too, where I wanted someone to justify how I was feeling, but I couldn't find any of that out there.
Yeah, it's pretty tough to find unless you're talking to someone like we are. Like it doesn't happen very often.
Mhm. I guess to bring it back to tokenism too, one of the, there is a theory about tokenism. It's mostly related to like women going into male dominated fields. That's kind of how the research originated. But one of the, like one of the pillars about tokenism is isolation.
Yeah, I'd have to agree on that. That's definitely that same kind of sentiment in like my experience being the token, uh, I would say person of color, because there was no one else on in these different workplaces that I was in. I had the extra like emotional labor to get other people to understand where I was at, that they didn't have to understand what I was actually experiencing because it wasn't part of their experience.
Yeah. So there's three pillars to the tokenism theory, and I'm kind of wondering if that's also the way you experience tokenism. So the first one is performance pressure, being made to feel like you have to do better work and produce more to like kind of justify being in that role. The second pillar is social isolation, feeling more alone, like nobody really understands you, like you have to explain yourself to people. And then the other one is what they call role encapsulation. People expect you to be a certain way and behave a certain way. To this theory is more about women in male dominated fields. So a lot of that is like expecting women to be submissive. And then when a woman doesn't act submissive, then they're taken aback or there's a little bit of backlash because they're just thrown off.
Yeah, I'd have to say all three for sure. There's this sense of all three of those pillars I've experienced in many of my workplaces that just don't have that same kind of like understanding of where they're hiring folks because they feel like they're being forced to hire people who are either racialized or indigenous, but don't necessarily quite fit into the mainstream mold. They want you to be your nose to the work and not complaining. With tokenism, there's that sense that they're kind of testing you out to see if you fit in, and also with clients because sometimes they don't necessarily like change. You're all on your own and you're not going to have support.
The person that developed the tokenism theory, one of the things that they implied was hiring more people that are part of whatever that minority group is. Hiring more of them will kind of lead to social change and more opportunities for that group. But there was a lot of also research critiquing that, saying no, it's more complicated than that, because when the dominant group sees people coming in, they're going to feel threatened and respond. And so sometimes it's not enough just to hire more people, but there also needs to be like, recognizing they're coming into a different, when they come into the workplace, they experience it differently.
we have to approach things from that systems based change. We need to look at a lot of the barriers that prevent people from actually reaching out and wanting help from anybody. A lot of the time, it's because of stigma, it's because of stereotypes, it's because we are an ableist society. Allyship is, I think, also referred to as co-conspiratorship, that we need to be co-conspirators and not just be like performative, like allies that just say, oh, yes, we're going to help you out and then you're on your way. We have to recognize that we are part of a social justice perspective, that we need to like give people that sense of being empowered. We're looking at intersectionality rather than seeing it as this is a race issue. This is like a social justice issue. This is racial justice, and this is what it looks like.
What would you say to people who feel like they're being tokenized? Or do you have any advice or anything you want to say to those people, or suggestions, maybe how they can respond?
The things that I've done in the past, I did look for others to be a co-conspirator with, to actually like address these problems and name these problems. So I did look to my colleagues who were either Indigenous or racialized. They may have come from completely different communities, but they had a basic understanding of where I was coming from. And they also basically lived with their heart. And I think that's a really important thing. A lot of organizations need to make that space for folks of color to be able to like gather and discuss these things. And then whatever comes from that will then be valued and taken seriously and moved forward. So, say, for example, you're able to get together, talk about some of these issues, name it, and then find training of some sort for the entire organization that's appropriate, or it's not surface. I've been to many cross-cultural trainings, cross-cultural trainings that were not good at all. They did not address how systemic many of these issues are. And it was just based on, having a casual conversation where you're just trying to meet somebody and talk to them on that level. There are people out there who do actually provide education from a perspective of their own, or from a cultural perspective that is appropriate, and then leads to connecting to communities that then can become much more empowered to move movements forward, to have that piece of social justice that we're looking for. And I think that in a lot of organizations, some of these trainings are just sort of for the social workers, but not the frontline staff who are on the telephone doing desk work and that are maybe administrative. I think that it needs to be in all areas of the agency, and to like recognize people are at different places, but to try and get people to one common place so that they can work together, or at least want things to be better, not just for one group, not just for one individual, but for everyone.
For people maybe that they're kind of part of the dominant group, yeah, how do you think they could help their colleagues who might be tokenized, like at their workplace?
I think that I've had colleagues who have understood what, like, they recognized what I was going through. They were hoping that I could basically school them on how to recognize racism or tokenism or what have you. And I was pretty upset with them. They didn't realize the emotional labor that they were putting on me and the pressure. I feel that these days I have colleagues who actually recognize that. They are trying to actually educate themselves and get themselves to a certain point where they can speak to me about these issues on a level where I don't have to be doing more work. But there are definitely instances where I have had to say, that's not my job to do that for you. And when I have colleagues that don't react badly to me saying that, even when I'm not so gentle about it, I think that's a change. And that's where I would appreciate that understanding. I think that there has to be learning all around, and that it's not just reliant on people who you think represent or some sort of like expertise in a culture. I think that there is more of an awakening, I would say, right now, that people do have to be more responsible with their privilege.
I guess to summarize, try to do your own research and then also to kind of have grace for people when they don't have the capacity to explain it to you.
Yeah, exactly. But it's recognize your own stuff and also don't impose on others.
Yeah, it is hard. I think it is hard to kind of like see your own privilege. It's like you don't have a frame of reference for it, so it's really hard to see. Um, but yeah, hopefully at least taking some steps forward and making mistakes and like at least trying is somewhere to start, right?
I think the idea of making a mistake is an okay thing, and accepting the fact that that is what's going to happen rather than being afraid that you're going to make a mistake and then be branded with that mistake and to forever try and avoid it. It leads to being paralyzed instead of like taking action forward. So I really do see that as being one of the ways in which you can become a very active, effective co-conspirator, rather than somebody who just doesn't act on much of anything and is silent unless they're thinking really hard and maybe just trying to drum up some motivation or some courage and confidence to actually get to a certain place where they can indeed be some sort of vehicle for folks who are more marginalized.
So keep trying, right? If you make a mistake, like you can take a step back and then get back onto it. And if you make a mistake, at least then you do kind of have somewhat of a frame of reference to work with then. People might get mad, but that's part of moving forward too, right? So
Yeah.
yeah.
For me, I feel like it's just like being strategic and being better. And I think that's what some of the time, whether it's an organization or it's an individual, just trying to figure out what to do next. I know that I've heard a lot of people like, oh, what do I do? Right. And it is trying to actually be better, be beyond what you've already done. And I do know that there's still some room for healthy looks back over the shoulder to see what's happened in the past. Because if we lose sight of what has happened in the past, that's where I think all of us kind of get into trouble.
So learn from your mistakes in the past, and try to keep kind of pushing your boundary and doing a little bit more than you did before, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Whatever that might be.
Thank you so much for coming on here and being able to share a lot of your thoughts. Really appreciate it. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Monica. It was great. It was fun.
Thank you for listening to Voices in Social Work. We hope you now have something new to talk about or explore. If you have any feedback or suggestions for future episodes, please email us at sswpodcast@carleton.ca. You can also visit voicesinsocialwork.podbean.com to see our full list of episodes and links to all of the ways you can listen to us. See you next time.